I am Harrison Caldwell, 70 years old, and I spent 4 decades building a logistics empire in Chicago from nothing. A few months ago, my wife Martha and I were sitting at a table in Le Bernardin, one of the most exclusive French restaurants in the city. It was Mother's Day. The chandelier above us must have cost more than my first warehouse. But all I could focus on was the sneer on my daughter-in-law Valerie's face. She was looking at Martha, my sweet, kind Martha, who had just spent 6 months fighting a brutal illness. Martha was wearing a simple, comfortable wool cardigan. It was her favorite. Valerie, dressed in some designer gown that probably cost thousands, leaned across the table and scoffed loud enough for the waiter to hear. "You couldn't have dressed up just a little, Martha. It's Le Bernardin, not a diner." Martha shrank back, her cheeks flushing. "I'm sorry, dear. I just wanted to be comfortable. The air conditioning is a bit strong." I felt a tight knot form in my chest. My calloused hands that had loaded freight trucks, drove 18-wheelers through blizzards, and signed the contracts that built our life tightened around my steak knife. I looked at Preston, my son. The boy I had broken my back for. The boy I had sent to an Ivy League school so he would never have to work a blue-collar job like me. He was staring down at his phone, completely ignoring his wife, humiliating his mother. "It's fine, Martha," I said, my voice low and steady. "You look beautiful." Valerie rolled her eyes and signaled for the check. When the waiter brought it over on a silver tray, she didn't even look at it. The bill was easily around $1,400. She casually pushed it across the table toward the waiter and pointed a perfectly manicured finger at me. "Split it. We're not paying for her." The silence that followed was suffocating. The waiter hesitated, looking back and forth between us. I looked at Preston again. He didn't look up. He just gave a small, pathetic nod of agreement, his eyes still glued to that damn screen. A cold fury settled over me. This was the son I had raised. This was the man who was currently running a tech startup with $600,000 of my money. I didn't say a word. I just kept cutting my steak piece by piece, chewing slowly. Let them play their games. I knew exactly who I was, and more importantly, I knew exactly what I owned. The waiter awkwardly took Valerie's card and Preston's card to run the split. I watched them go. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Finally, the waiter returned, but he wasn't alone. The general manager of the restaurant, Julian, was walking quickly behind him. Valerie sat up a little straighter, probably expecting the manager to ask us to leave because of Martha's cardigan. Julian stopped at our table. He didn't look at Valerie. He didn't look at Preston. He looked straight at me, the old man in flannel, and bowed his head slightly. "Good evening, Mr. Caldwell. It's a pleasure to see you again. Please, this meal is entirely on the house tonight." Valerie's jaw dropped. "On the house? Why?" Julian turned to her, his expression turning ice cold. "Because Madam Mr. Caldwell owns this entire commercial high-rise. We are honored to have him dine with us." The color drained from Valerie's face so fast, she looked like she might faint. The surrounding elite guests, the ones she had been trying so hard to impress, were now whispering and staring. But Julian wasn't finished. He turned to Preston, handing back his platinum credit card. "Sir," Julian said, his voice dropping slightly, but carrying clearly in the quiet dining room. "I'm afraid your bank has placed a severe delinquency freeze on your accounts. All 4 of your cards have declined due to insufficient funds." Preston's head snapped up from his phone, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. That's impossible. Run it again." "We ran them 3 times, sir. The bank insists the accounts are frozen." Valerie looked like she had been slapped. The embarrassment, the sheer humiliation she had tried to force onto my wife had just rebounded onto her with 10 times the force. I didn't gloat. I didn't say, "I told you so." I calmly reached into my pocket, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and handed it to the waiter for his trouble. I stood up, offered my arm to Martha, and we walked out of that restaurant, leaving Preston and Valerie sitting there in stunned silence. The drive home was quiet. Martha squeezed my hand, offering me a small, sad smile. but my mind was racing. Insufficient funds, a severe delinquency freeze. 6 months ago, I had written Preston a check for $600,000 to secure office space and cover initial operating costs for his new tech venture. He had told me they were finalizing a massive $5 million venture capital deal. If that money was coming in, why were his credit cards maxed out? Something was deeply, deeply wrong, and I was going to find out exactly what it was. The words hung in the air, sharp and suffocating. Insufficient funds. Valerie let out a breathless scoff, snatching the platinum card back from the waiter's tray. She glared at the young man, her eyes narrowing with absolute disdain. She told him to run it again, her voice rising an octave, snapping that his machine was broken. The waiter, a polite kid just trying to do his job, nervously stepped back. He murmured a quiet apology, explaining that he had already tried both her card and Preston's card 3 times each. The terminal had rejected all of them. Valerie's face flushed a mottled red. She slammed her hand down on the white tablecloth, causing the crystal glasses to clink together. She raised her voice, drawing the eyes of the wealthy patrons at the adjacent tables. She demanded to know what kind of establishment this was, accusing the waiter of deliberately embarrassing her. I sat there in my flannel shirt and work boots, completely silent, watching the scene unfold. I did not look at the waiter, nor did I look at Valerie. My eyes were fixed entirely on my son. Preston was shrinking into his seat. The boy who demanded a $60,000 wedding was suddenly looking very small. He stared down at his lap, his jaw tight, his hands trembling where they rested on his knees. He did not defend his wife. He did not defend the waiter. He just sat there, sweating, under the soft glow of the dining room chandelier. A cold realization began to settle in my stomach. A man who was about to close a $5 million venture capital deal does not sweat when a restaurant bill is declined. A man with millions in backing simply hands over another card. Preston was terrified. Martha shifted uncomfortably beside me. She reached out, her gentle hand resting on my forearm. She whispered my name, her voice laced with that same quiet anxiety she always had whenever conflict arose. She told me she had some cash in her purse, offering to cover the bill so we could leave. My chest tightened. After fighting her way back to health, after enduring months of hospital stays, she was sitting here on Mother's Day, offering to empty her coin purse because our son and his arrogant wife decided she was not worth paying for. I placed my hand over hers and gave it a reassuring squeeze. I told her softly that she would not be paying a single cent for this meal. Valerie was now fully out of her seat, demanding to speak to the general manager. She loudly proclaimed that they spent thousands of dollars at this establishment every year and would not tolerate being treated like common criminals by an incompetent server. The whispers from the surrounding tables grew louder, filled with curious, judgmental glances. Valerie was putting on a spectacular show, entirely blind to the reality of her own situation. Before the young waiter could turn around, a tall, impeccably dressed man stepped out from the shadows near the wine cellar. It was Julian, the general manager. He approached our table, his face a mask of professional calm. Valerie pointed a sharp finger at him, demanding he fire the waiter on the spot for humiliating her family. Julian did not flinch. He did not apologize. He did not even look at her. He bypassed Valerie completely, stepped around the edge of our table, and stopped directly in front of me. He bowed his head slightly, a gesture of deep, unforced respect. He addressed me by name, his voice smooth and steady, cutting right through Valerie's rant. He told me it was an absolute honor to have me dining in his establishment today. Then he announced to the table that the meal was entirely on the house. Valerie stopped mid-sentence. Her mouth hung open slightly. She blinked, looking from Julian to me, and then back to Julian. She let out a confused laugh, asking why the manager was comping a meal for a man dressed like a retired lumberjack. She reminded Julian that she and Preston were the VIP guests, the ones who made the reservation under their corporate account. Julian finally turned his gaze to Valerie. His eyes were devoid of any warmth. He told her in a voice that carried perfectly across the hushed dining space that the meal was complimentary because I owned the entire commercial high-rise building. He explained that my real estate firm was the landlord for the restaurant, the corporate offices above us, and the luxury penthouses. The blood completely drained from Valerie's face. Her arrogant sneer vanished, replaced by sheer shock. She had spent 3 years treating me like an uneducated peasant, unaware that the money funding her luxurious lifestyle came from the very empire I built with my bare hands. But Julian was not finished. He turned his attention to Preston. My son looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him. Julian's tone grew colder, stripped of all hospitality. He informed Preston that he had personally contacted the bank's merchant services division to resolve the terminal error. He stated clearly and without hesitation that the bank flagged Preston's accounts for severe delinquency. There was no security freeze. The accounts were maxed out and shut down by creditors. The silence in the restaurant was absolute. The wealthy patrons around us were no longer just whispering. They were staring openly, witnessing the complete social destruction of a couple who had spent the last 20 minutes acting like royalty. Preston buried his face in his hands. He did not say a word. The lie was exposed. The illusion of his massive success, the supposed $5 million tech deal, the entire foundation of their arrogant lifestyle, had just crumbled in the restaurant. Valerie stood frozen, her chest heaving as she struggled to comprehend what was happening. The woman who proudly declared she would not pay for my wife's meal was now standing completely destitute in front of the entire Chicago elite. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I felt no joy in seeing my son humiliated, only a profound sense of betrayal. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a crisp, neatly folded $100 bill. I placed it gently on the table right next to Valerie's rejected platinum card. I looked at the young waiter who was standing quietly behind Julian and told him the cash was for his excellent service and remarkable patience. I did not look at Preston. I did not look at Valerie. I simply stood up, pushed my chair in, and offered my arm to Martha. My wife took my arm, her head held high, wrapped in the simple wool cardigan that Valerie had mocked earlier. We walked out of the dining room together, our steps steady and calm, leaving the heavy, suffocating silence behind us. The valet brought my older truck around. I opened the passenger door for Martha, making sure she was comfortable. As I drove us away, my mind raced. The missing $600,000. The maxed-out credit cards. Something was deeply wrong. I would soon find out exactly what. Before I could even put the truck into drive, the passenger side door of the rear cab swung open. Preston and Valerie practically threw themselves into the back seat of my Ford. The leather interior squeaked under their sudden weight. I looked at them through the rearview mirror. Preston was pale, a thin sheen of sweat coating his forehead, despite the cool Chicago evening air. His hands were shaking as he gripped his knees. He looked like a cornered animal trying to figure out which way to run. Valerie was no longer the haughty socialite from the dining room. She had buried her face in her hands, her shoulders heaving with exaggerated, theatrical sobs. Martha sat very quietly beside me in the front passenger seat, staring straight ahead through the windshield. She did not say a word, and her silence was heavier than any lecture she could have given. I put the truck into gear and slowly pulled out of the valet lane, merging into the downtown traffic. The neon lights of the city reflected off the hood of my truck, casting long shadows across Preston's panicked face in the mirror. I waited for him to speak. I knew he would not be able to handle the quiet. My son had never been able to sit in silence. He always had to fill the void with excuses, with justifications, with a desperate need to control the narrative. And right on cue, as we stopped at the first red light on Michigan Avenue, the frantic rambling began. He immediately leaned forward, his hands gripping the back of my seat. He started talking so fast, the words tripped over each other. He told me it was all a massive misunderstanding with his financial institution. He claimed the bank had initiated an automatic security freeze on all his personal and business accounts. According to him, the freezing protocol was triggered by an unprecedented influx of capital. He said his tech startup had just secured a $5 million venture capital transfer that morning. He spun a complex tale about international wire regulations, anti-money laundering audits, and overzealous bank managers flagging the sudden wealth. He insisted that when you move millions of dollars across borders, the compliance algorithms automatically lock everything down until a human auditor can verify the source of the funds. He sounded incredibly rehearsed. He threw around corporate buzzwords like liquidity constraints and institutional compliance, the kind of terminology he learned at Wharton, the exact kind of language designed to confuse and pacify a man who built his fortune moving shipping containers instead of digital assets. He swore up and down that the funds would be completely released by Monday morning and that the declined cards were nothing more than a temporary, embarrassing technological glitch. He begged me not to think poorly of his success based on a stupid algorithmic error. Valerie chimed in right on cue. She lifted her head from her hands, her mascara carefully preserved, despite the supposed tears. She reached out and lightly touched Martha's shoulder, a gesture that felt entirely hollow. She let out a trembling sigh and started blaming her horrific behavior in the restaurant on the immense pressure of their social standing. She sobbed about the crushing weight of high society stress, about how difficult it was to maintain the image of a successful CEO wife in a city that constantly judged you. She claimed she had been incredibly anxious all week about the venture capital deal falling through, and that her anxiety simply manifested as a momentary lapse in judgment. She looked at Martha through the rearview mirror and offered a breathless, fragile apology. She said she was just so overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of their new wealth that she forgot her manners, blaming her cruelty on exhaustion rather than her own character. She promised to make it up to Martha, suggesting a spa day once the bank unfroze their millions. It was a masterful performance, a perfect blend of victimhood and subtle bragging. They were a unified front of deception, painting themselves as the tragic victims of their own massive success. They expected me to swallow the story whole. I kept my eyes focused firmly on the road ahead. I nodded slowly, deliberately, maintaining a neutral expression. I told Preston I understood how complicated banking could be. I told Valerie that stress makes people do foolish things. I gave them exactly the absolution they were desperately seeking. I could practically hear the collective sigh of relief emanating from the back seat. They genuinely believed they had smoothed over the cracks. They believed the old man in flannel had bought the corporate jargon without a second thought. But while I was nodding and smiling at the red lights, my gut was screaming. Every instinct I had honed over 40 years in commercial logistics was telling me I was sitting in a truck with two liars. My mind drifted back to a brisk morning exactly 6 months ago. Preston had come to my home office, pacing the floor with grand blueprints and aggressive financial projections. He had pitched me his visionary tech startup, promising to revolutionize supply chain software. He had asked for a seed investment to secure premium office space in the financial district and to cover the initial operating overhead. I had written him a check for $600,000. I handed over more than $500,000 of my own hard-earned capital because I believed in supporting my blood. I know how business works. I know the life cycle of a startup. If you secure a legitimate $5 million venture capital injection, your primary banking institution does not freeze your personal platinum credit cards over a weekend. A bank caters to clients moving that kind of volume. They assign you a dedicated wealth manager. They extend lines of credit. They do not leave you standing in a restaurant unable to cover a simple dinner bill. Furthermore, if venture capital was truly flowing in, why were his cards maxed out in the first place? A security freeze prevents new transactions, but it does not alter your existing balance. Julian had specifically stated the accounts were flagged for severe delinquency. Delinquency means unpaid debts. It means you owe money you do not have. The math simply did not add up. You do not burn through a $600,000 initial investment in 6 months and then suddenly hit a $5 million jackpot while carrying severe credit delinquency. Preston was bleeding cash. He was drowning, and he was trying to convince me he was learning how to swim. I drove the rest of the way in absolute silence, letting their fake apologies fill the cab. I pulled into their pristine suburban driveway, put the truck in park, and waited for them to exit. They thanked us profusely, promising a proper celebration next week. I watched them walk up to their heavy oak front door. My son was living a carefully constructed lie. The missing $600,000 was just the beginning. I knew I desperately needed to uncover the cold, hard, absolute truth right away. The sun had barely crested the Chicago skyline when I pulled my truck out of our driveway the next morning. Martha was still sleeping, soundly exhausted from the emotional toll of the previous night. I left a quiet note on the kitchen counter and headed straight toward the affluent northern suburbs. Preston had called me 3 days ago, casually mentioning that the primary track on his 3-car garage was misaligned. He did not ask for a recommendation for a repair service. He simply stated the problem, fully expecting his old man to drive over with a toolbox and fix it for free. For years, I had accepted this dynamic. I convinced myself that performing physical labor for my son was a way to stay connected, a way to show my love through acts of service. Even after I handed him a check for over $500,000 to build his corporate dreams to him, I was still just the handyman in a flannel shirt. I pulled into his sprawling driveway just before 7. Valerie's gleaming white Range Rover sat parked near the entrance, a stark contrast to my weathered Ford. The neighborhood was silent, wrapped in the quiet comfort of immense wealth. I grabbed my heavy canvas tool bag from the truck bed and punched the keypad code to open the side door of the garage. The air inside was cool and smelled faintly of expensive leather and imported car wax. I set my bag down on the pristine epoxy floor and looked up at the broken torsion spring on the middle door. It was a simple fix when I had done 100 times on my own commercial warehouses. I put on my work gloves and began loosening the brackets. As I turned the wrench, my mind kept drifting back to the restaurant. The declined credit cards. The frantic excuses about banking algorithms and venture capital audits. Preston had sworn the accounts would be magically unfrozen by Monday. The mechanical work usually cleared my head, but today every scrape of metal against metal only amplified the uneasy feeling in my chest. I needed a clean rag to wipe down the heavy industrial grease from the upper track. I walked over to the corner of the large garage where a row of immaculately sorted waste bins stood lined up against the drywall. Valerie was famously obsessive about her recycling, ensuring the household staff separated every piece of plastic and cardboard. I opened the lid of the primary utility bin, expecting to find empty oil bottles or discarded yard waste bags. Instead, I saw a strange, heavy lump of thick parchment paper shoved aggressively all the way to the bottom. It was half buried under a pile of damp, foul-smelling grass clippings, deliberately pushed down to ensure no one would ever accidentally see it. My calloused fingers reached into the bin and pulled the crumpled ball out. The paper felt heavy, entirely different from standard household mail. It was a certified parcel envelope, the kind that requires a direct signature upon delivery. I wiped my hands on my jeans and slowly smoothed the paper out over my metal workbench under the harsh fluorescent garage lights. The top left corner bore a seal that I recognized immediately. The eagle, the scales, the bold, unmistakable lettering. It was the Department of the Treasury, the Internal Revenue Service. A cold, sharp chill ran down my spine. The document was heavily stamped in bright, aggressive red ink across the top margin. Final notice. Notice of intent to seize property. I grabbed my reading glasses from my shirt pocket and leaned closer to the workbench. The document was addressed directly to Preston Caldwell, citing his technology startup as the primary liable entity. I read the first paragraph and my breath caught in my throat. The notification was not a standard audit request. It was an active, aggressive execution order for severe tax evasion and delinquent corporate filings. I traced my finger down the itemized list of infractions. The numbers printed on that thick government paper were staggering. Preston owed hundreds of thousands of dollars in unpaid federal payroll taxes, corporate income taxes, and compounded failure to pay penalties. The dates of the infractions stretched back well over a year. The IRS was not auditing a sudden influx of $5 million in venture capital. They were actively moving to seize his personal and business assets because he had been completely defaulting on his federal obligations. The story he had spun in the back of my truck the night before was an absolute fabricated lie. The bank had not frozen his platinum cards out of an abundance of caution over international wires. The federal government had legally locked his accounts to recoup stolen tax revenue. I stood perfectly still in the quiet, climate-controlled garage, the harsh reality washing over me like a bucket of freezing water. My son was not a successful tech visionary navigating the complex world of high finance. He was a desperate, drowning man hiding from federal investigators. The anger that had been simmering since the restaurant finally boiled over into a sharp, focused rage. 6 months ago, I had sat across from Preston in my home study. I had listened to his passionate presentation, looked at his projected growth charts, and written a personal check for $600,000. That money was explicitly earmarked for securing a commercial lease in the financial district, hiring initial coding staff, and establishing server infrastructure. It was supposed to be his foundation. If he owed the federal government hundreds of thousands of dollars in long-standing delinquent taxes, where on earth did my $600,000 actually go? It certainly had not gone toward settling his massive debts with the Treasury. It had vanished completely. I looked back at the red-stamped paper on the metal workbench. The printed dates proved he was already in severe financial distress when he came to me asking for that initial seed money. He had knowingly taken my capital under completely false pretenses. He had looked me directly in the eyes, smiled, and blatantly lied to my face. I carefully folded the federal seizure notice and slipped it into the inner pocket of my heavy flannel shirt. I grabbed my wrench and methodically finished realigning the garage door track. I wiped down the grease, packed my tools away, and securely closed the heavy canvas bag. I did not go inside the spacious house to say good morning to my son or his arrogant wife. I did not want to see their faces. If I walked into that luxurious kitchen right now, I knew I would not be able to control the righteous fury tearing through my chest. Instead, I walked back to my truck, tossed the tool bag into the bed, and slid behind the steering wheel. I needed to know the full extent of this devastating deception. I needed to see the corporate reality with my own eyes. I started the engine, pulled out of the quiet suburban neighborhood, and headed straight for the city. I was finally going to find out the truth. I navigated my truck onto the expressway. The Chicago skyline rose like a glass fortress against the morning sky. Traffic was dense, a sea of commuters heading into the financial district. I merged into the flow, my grip on the worn leather steering wheel rigid. The red-stamped seizure notice burned like an ember inside my flannel pocket. I did not call Preston. Confronting a chronic liar without holding the facts is a fool's errand. Instead, I drove straight to the towering skyscraper housing the law offices of Mitchell Reed. Mitchell was the ruthless architect who helped construct my logistics empire. He knew where every cent of my money was allocated and protected my interests with the fierce loyalty of a guard dog. I parked in the underground garage and took the executive elevator to the 42nd floor. The reception area was an intimidating expanse of polished marble. The receptionist blinked in surprise at my faded flannel shirt and scuffed boots. Before she could ask for my appointment, Mitchell stepped out of his corner office. He took one look at my grim expression, dismissed the confused receptionist, and ushered me inside behind his soundproof doors. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the crumpled tax notice I had salvaged from my son's garbage, and placed it flat on Mitchell's massive oak desk. Mitchell adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and read the terrifying document in total silence. For a man who rarely showed emotion, the slight tightening of his jaw spoke volumes. He looked up at me, his sharp eyes filled with genuine concern. He asked directly where I had found an active federal seizure warrant addressed to my only son. I told him the entire truth. I recounted the humiliating dinner at the expensive French restaurant the night before. I detailed the declined platinum credit cards and the frantic lies about a venture capital audit. I explained my quiet morning discovery hidden deep in the garage trash bin. I told him I needed to know exactly what was happening inside Preston's technology startup. Mitchell simply gave a curt nod, turned to his multi-monitor workstation, and began typing with practiced speed. He bypassed standard search engines and logged directly into the secure federal and state corporate registry databases. The silence inside the luxurious office was heavy, punctuated only by the rapid clicking of his keyboard. I paced the room, looking out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling city below, waiting for the verdict. 10 grueling minutes passed. Then 15 agonizing minutes. Finally, Mitchell stopped typing. He leaned back slowly in his premium leather chair and let out an incredibly heavy breath. He turned his primary monitor around so I could clearly see the illuminated screen. It was filled entirely with rows of dense bureaucratic text and harsh red status markers. Mitchell looked me dead in the eye and delivered the devastating news with surgical precision. He told me that my son's groundbreaking technology startup, the very company I had personally funded with $600,000 just 6 months ago, did not exist. I stared blankly at the glowing screen, my mind fiercely struggling to process his words. I asked him what he meant, stubbornly insisting I had personally seen the official incorporation papers and the commercial lease agreements. Mitchell pointed a steady finger to a specific highlighted line on the screen. The company had been legally and officially dissolved by the state exactly 8 months ago due to severe tax delinquency and a total failure to file required operational reports. It was completely defunct. It was a legally dead entity. My breathing suddenly felt very shallow. I quickly asked Mitchell about the prestigious downtown office space. Preston had actually given Martha and me a grand tour of the impressive lobby just a few months prior. He had proudly pointed to a premium suite on the 20th floor. He complained constantly about his grueling daily commute into the bustling city. Mitchell typed another quick query into his secure database and pulled up the detailed commercial leasing records for that specific building address. The truth landed like a physical blow to my chest. The impressive suite number Preston claimed as his bustling corporate headquarters was not a technology hub at all. It was merely a commercial mailroom. Preston was paying exactly $50 a month for a basic virtual mailbox service that simply forwarded his mail and provided a fancy downtown address to print on his glossy business cards. He had absolutely no office. He had no loyal employees. He had no expensive server infrastructure. For nearly a full year, my son had been waking up early every single morning, putting on a tailored Italian suit, kissing his wife goodbye, and driving directly into the city to simply sit in local coffee shops or endlessly wander the crowded streets. He was diligently playing the role of a highly successful chief executive officer, while his entire professional life was nothing more than a fabricated phantom. The sheer scale of the betrayal was so profound it literally made me dizzy. I sat down heavily in one of the plush leather guest chairs. 6 months ago, I had handed him a massive certified check. If his technology company was already legally dead and dissolved 2 full months before I ever wrote that check, what exactly did he do with all the money? It certainly had not gone to the Internal Revenue Service, as was clearly evidenced by the active seizure notice aggressively threatening to liquidate all his personal assets. It had not gone to commercial real estate leases. It had not gone to employee payroll. More than $500,000 of my fiercely hard-earned wealth had simply vanished completely into thin air. Mitchell watched me carefully, his hands thoughtfully steepled, resting on his desk. He stated the obvious conclusion, noting gravely that Preston was operating a massive, sustained financial fraud against his own family. He asked me if I wanted him to immediately freeze the remaining family trust funds and initiate a rigorous forensic financial audit to meticulously trace exactly where the cash had been funneled. I looked down at my rough, scarred hands. I thought about Valerie arrogantly sneering at my sweet wife in that restaurant. I thought about Preston standing nervously in his driveway, lying directly to my face without a single ounce of visible shame. I told Mitchell that a proper financial audit would take weeks to complete. I simply did not have weeks. The federal government was rapidly moving to seize all assets, and Preston was clearly desperate enough to do something incredibly reckless. I needed to know exactly what my son was planning right now, completely behind closed doors, when he thought absolutely no one was watching him. I truly needed to catch him in the act. I instructed Mitchell to begin quietly preparing the necessary legal defense structures to entirely distance my own personal assets from Preston's impending federal fallout. I told him to draft absolutely everything in complete secrecy. Meanwhile, I had a completely different kind of investigation to conduct. I stood up from the comfortable leather chair, the initial shock fully giving way to a cold, highly calculated resolve. I thanked Mitchell for his swift and efficient work and walked out of the towering glass building. I stepped back out onto the bustling Chicago sidewalk, allowing the loud noise of the sprawling city to wash over me. I needed to get inside Preston's house today. I needed to hear the secretive conversations happening within those walls. I needed a flawless decoy to grant me access. By the time I finally reached my parked truck, the plan was fully formed and solidified in my mind. I was going to tell them that Martha and I were leaving town immediately for a long vacation. I drove back to our quiet suburban home, the roar of the Chicago traffic fading into the background, but the noise inside my head was deafening. I needed a flawless decoy, a story so ordinary and airtight that Preston and Valerie would not think twice about my absence. When I walked through the front door, Martha was sitting in her favorite armchair, reading a book in the soft afternoon light. She looked up, her kind eyes searching my face for any lingering anger from the disastrous dinner the night before. I forced a gentle smile, walked over and kissed the top of her head. I told her I had a wonderful idea to celebrate her newly restored health. I suggested she spend the entire week at her sister's house in Wisconsin, a trip she had been putting off for months. Her face lit up with genuine joy at the prospect of a quiet, sisterly retreat. I helped her pack a small suitcase, promising I would use the time to catch up on some overdue maintenance projects around our property. As soon as I had safely dropped Martha off at the train station and watched her wave goodbye from the platform, I pulled my cell phone from my pocket. I dialed Preston's number. He answered on the second ring, his voice dripping with an unnatural, forced cheerfulness. I kept my tone perfectly level, playing the part of the oblivious, forgiving father. I told him that Martha and I had decided to take a spontaneous week-long fishing trip up to an off-the-grid cabin in northern Michigan. I laid the groundwork carefully, explaining that the remote location meant we would have absolutely no cell phone service or internet access for the next 7 days. I instructed him not to worry if he could not reach us. Preston eagerly bought the lie. I could actually hear the profound relief exhaling through the receiver. He enthusiastically wished us a wonderful trip and promised we would have a proper family dinner the moment we returned. He thought he had just been handed a full week of unsupervised freedom. He thought the old man was completely out of the picture. I ended the call and immediately turned my truck around, heading straight to a specialized electronics supply store in the industrial district. I purchased 3 high-definition microcameras, the kind designed for discreet commercial surveillance. They were barely the size of a postage stamp, equipped with motion sensors, infrared night vision, and internal wireless transmitters that would stream a live feed directly to a secured cloud server. I also bought a fresh roll of matte black electrical tape, a specialized set of precision screwdrivers, and a heavy-duty flashlight. I threw the supplies into my canvas tool bag, the very same bag I had carried into Preston's garage just a few hours earlier. I waited until the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, dark shadows across the city suburbs. At precisely 8 o'clock that evening, I drove back into Preston and Valerie's exclusive neighborhood. I parked my truck 3 blocks away, completely out of sight, hidden behind a row of tall cedar hedges. I walked the remaining distance on foot, moving quietly through the manicured backyards and pristine landscaping. I knew their daily schedule intimately. Thursday evenings were reserved for Valerie's exclusive country club dinners, and Preston always accompanied her to maintain their fragile social facade. The house was completely dark. The driveway was empty. The stage was perfectly set. I approached the rear of the property, slipping through the side gate I had personally repaired a dozen times. Preston had recently boasted about spending $5,000 on a state-of-the-art smart home security system. He loved flashing the mobile app in my face, bragging about the perimeter sensors and the encrypted digital locks. But Preston only understood the shiny software interface. I understood the physical architecture. I had spent 40 years building commercial structures, laying miles of wiring, and supervising the installation of security grids for corporate warehouses. A system is only as strong as its physical power source. I moved directly to the external utility box mounted on the side of the brick facade. Using a specialized bypass key I always kept on my keychain. I opened the gray panel. I did not cut the power, which would instantly trigger a battery backup and send a silent alarm to the monitoring company. Instead, I carefully isolated the specific data bridge connecting the external sensors to the internal hub. Using a pair of rubber-gripped pliers and a simple jumper wire, I created a localized data loop. The system still registered as fully armed and active, but the sensory input from the rear sliding door was completely neutralized. I slid the glass door open and stepped into the silent, luxurious kitchen. The air felt heavy, tainted by the massive deception living within these walls. I did not turn on any lights. I navigated the familiar layout, using only the ambient moonlight filtering through the large bay windows. I moved quickly and efficiently, walking straight toward the central living room. This was the primary social space, the room where Valerie entertained her wealthy guests, and where Preston undoubtedly conducted his desperate late-night phone calls. I positioned a stepping stool beneath the large rectangular HVAC return vent set high on the wall. I carefully unscrewed the painted metal grate, ensuring not a single fleck of drywall dust fell to the pristine hardwood floor below. I retrieved the first micro camera from my pocket. I wrapped the tiny base in matte black tape to prevent any metallic reflection. I mounted it securely onto the inner lip of the galvanized steel ductwork, positioning the lens to look out through the slanted louvers of the metal grate. The angle provided a flawless, unobstructed view of the plush white sofas and the modern fireplace. I activated the power switch and checked the encrypted feed on my mobile phone. The night vision kicked in, perfectly illuminating the dark room in a sharp, crisp, monochrome resolution. I screwed the metal grate back into place, wiping away any trace of my fingerprints with a microfiber cloth. I quietly made my way down the carpeted hallway toward Preston's private study. This was his supposed sanctuary, the room where he pretended to run his non-existent technology empire. The door was unlocked. I stepped inside, the faint smell of expensive scotch lingering in the stagnant air. His massive mahogany desk was immaculately clean, a superficial prop for a hollow career. I placed the stool beneath the ceiling ventilation duct directly above his leather executive chair. I removed the metal cover and installed the second camera, angling it straight down to capture the entire desk surface, the computer monitor, and anyone sitting in the chairs opposite the desk. I installed the third and final camera inside a decorative ventilation grate near the main entryway of the study, ensuring I had a clear visual of anyone walking through the door. I synced all 3 cameras to my secure server, verifying the audio capture was perfectly sharp. I carefully retraced my steps through the dark house, locked the rear door, and vanished. I drove my truck away from the manicured lawns of Preston's neighborhood, heading toward the commercial outskirts of the sprawling city. I found a dilapidated motel about 2 miles down the main highway, a place that rented rooms by the week and did not ask for a credit card. The neon sign buzzed with a dying fluorescent hum, casting a sickly red glow across the cracked asphalt parking lot. I paid cash for a corner room on the second floor, a cramped space that smelled faintly of stale bleach and old cigarette smoke. The patterned wallpaper was peeling, and the mattress sagged terribly in the middle. but I did not care about the lack of basic amenities. I only needed a locked door and a stable wireless internet connection. I set my canvas tool bag on the floor and placed my laptop squarely on the scratched laminate desk pushed against the far wall. I pulled the blackout curtains shut, plunging the room into absolute artificial darkness. I powered up the laptop, navigated directly to the secured cloud server, and entered my encryption keys. The screen immediately fractured into 3 distinct video feeds streaming perfectly, in sharp detail. The audio capture was crystal clear. I took a deep breath, leaned back in the flimsy wooden chair, and formally began my silent vigil. The first 24 hours were a masterclass in watching a man unravel completely. Without an audience to perform for the confident chief executive officer ceased to exist. Through the camera hidden securely in the study ventilation grate, I watched my son pace the length of his expensive oriental rug like a trapped animal. He did not put on a tailored suit. He wore the exact same wrinkled sweatpants and faded gray cotton shirt for the entire day. He spent hours staring blankly at the massive mahogany desk, the surface completely devoid of any actual business documents. The only thing occupying his attention was a heavy crystal decanter of imported scotch. I watched him pour glass after glass, his hands trembling so violently that the amber liquid spilled over the rim and stained the expensive wood. He would repeatedly slump into his leather executive chair, burying his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with the suffocating weight of his own massive deception. Every single time his mobile phone vibrated on the desk, he physically flinched, staring at the illuminated screen with absolute terror before deliberately ignoring the incoming call. He was a man entirely consumed by total fear, hiding from the federal government, hiding from his angry creditors, and desperately hiding from the reality he had artificially created. I sat in my dark motel room eating cold sandwiches from a nearby convenience store, watching the agonizing reality of my son's pathetic existence unfold in sharp digital clarity. The blazing anger I felt was slowly being replaced by a profound, hollow sense of utter disgust. The true toxic nature of their marriage was brutally exposed the moment Valerie entered the video frame. Through the living room camera, I saw her storm down the carpeted hallway, bypassing the closed study, and march straight toward the ornate liquor cabinet. She poured herself a massive glass of chilled white wine before calling out for Preston. He emerged from his dark sanctuary looking haggard and utterly defeated, holding his own empty crystal glass. The fierce argument ignited instantly, burning with a rooted destructive resentment. Valerie did not ask a single question about the federal seizure notice. She did not ask about the crippling corporate debt or the threat of severe criminal prosecution. Her voice, shrill and piercing through my laptop speakers, demanded to know exactly how they were going to pay the exorbitant quarterly dues for her exclusive country club. She screamed that her entire social circle was already whispering about the disastrous dinner at the French restaurant, and that if her premium membership lapsed, she would be humiliated in front of the Chicago elite. She paced in front of the modern stone fireplace, waving her wine glass, accusing Preston of being a monumental failure. She shrieked that she had married a visionary tech founder, not a pathetic fraud who could not afford to cover a simple dinner bill. Preston did not defend himself. He cowered. He shrank back against the hallway wall, murmuring weak promises about securing a massive bridge loan by the end of the month. He begged her to be patient, swearing he had a foolproof plan to generate liquid cash immediately. Valerie scoffed, a vicious, cruel sound that echoed through the hidden microphone. She told him that if he did not deposit $50,000 into her checking account by Friday afternoon, she was packing her bags and driving straight to a divorce attorney. She drained her glass, slammed it down on the kitchen island, and stormed up the wooden stairs, leaving Preston standing alone in the center of his fraudulent mansion. The tension inside the large house rapidly became a palpable, suffocating entity. Throughout the second day of my surveillance, the atmosphere was incredibly toxic and heavy. Preston and Valerie actively avoided each other, moving silently through the suburban house like hostile ghosts whenever they accidentally crossed paths in the expansive living room or the modern kitchen. The silence between them was incredibly sharp and combative. I remained firmly glued to the uncomfortable wooden chair in my dark motel room, my tired eyes burning from staring intently at the bright laptop screen. I drank awful lukewarm coffee from a cheap styrofoam cup, meticulously logging every single time Preston nervously answered a hushed, secretive phone call, or frantically checked his rapidly dwindling bank balances. He spent the late afternoon frantically searching through the deep drawers of his mahogany desk, furiously pulling out old credit card statements and aggressively shredding them into tiny, unrecognizable pieces. He was systematically destroying vital evidence of his total financial ruin. The sun finally set on the exhausting second day, casting long shadows across the 3 active camera feeds. The sprawling house grew incredibly quiet. Valerie had angrily retreated to the master bedroom several hours ago, leaving Preston entirely alone in his dark study. He was heavily slouched in his large chair, completely inebriated, staring blankly at the dark computer monitor. I quickly checked the glowing digital clock, positioned in the corner of my screen. It was exactly midnight. The affluent neighborhood was dead silent, firmly wrapped in the heavy, oppressive darkness of a late weeknight. I slowly stretched my aching back mentally, preparing for another long, uneventful night of relentless observation. Then the piercing digital chime of the front doorbell suddenly echoed fiercely through the hidden microphones. The sound was jarring, cutting violently through the absolute silence of the sleeping house like a sharp knife. Preston practically jumped out of his leather chair, his crystal glass shattering violently on the hardwood floor. Through the living room camera, I watched him stumble awkwardly out of the study, his face completely drained of all color. He stood absolutely frozen at the end of the long hallway, staring in sheer terror at the heavy oak front door as the loud bell chimed a second, much more aggressive time. The heavy oak front door swung inward with a slow, agonizing creak. Through the living room camera feed on my laptop, I watched a man step into the foyer. He did not look like a federal agent, nor did he look like a standard debt collector. He was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit over an athletic frame, his posture radiating effortless confidence. He simply glided over the threshold. Preston backed away, his hands raised defensively. He was trembling so violently I could see his shoulders shaking through the digital feed. The stranger closed the door with a definitive click that echoed ominously in the quiet house. The man offered a polished smile that did not reach his cold eyes. He walked past Preston directly into the center of the living room, right into the primary viewing angle of my hidden camera. He unbuttoned his suit jacket and sat comfortably on Valerie's pristine white designer sofa, crossing one leg over the other. He gestured for Preston to take a seat opposite him, behaving exactly like a gracious host. Preston did not sit. He remained standing near the hallway archway, completely frozen, looking like a man staring directly at his own executioner. "Hello, Preston," the man said. His voice, captured with crystalline clarity by the microphone in the ventilation duct, was smooth quiet and absolutely dripping with menace. "You have been incredibly difficult to reach today. It hurts my feelings when my calls go straight to voicemail." Preston finally found his voice. It emerged as a pathetic, high-pitched stammer. He begged the man calling him Damon to please understand his current situation. Preston frantically resurrected the exact same lie he had peddled to me in my truck. He claimed a $5 million venture capital transfer was frozen by banking compliance protocols. He swore the funds would clear by Monday morning, promising to wire the full balance the absolute second the institutional hold was lifted. Damon listened patiently, resting his chin on his steepled fingers. When Preston finally ran out of breath, Damon let out a soft, chilling laugh. It was the sound of a predator playing with its food. He looked around the luxurious living room, admiring the modern art and the expensive fixtures. He calmly stated that he did not care about fabricated venture capital transfers or imaginary banking algorithms. He knew exactly what Preston was doing, and he knew exactly where the money was supposedly going. Damon leaned forward, his terrifyingly calm smile vanishing from his sharp face. He spoke with brutal precision, reminding Preston that a phantom technology startup does not magically secure millions in corporate funding. Damon knew there were no software engineers, no downtown office spaces, and absolutely no revolutionary products. He slowly articulated the devastating truth I had spent the last 24 hours agonizing over. Through the audio feed, Damon casually mentioned the initial $600,000. My money. The seed capital I had proudly handed my son to build a legitimate business. Damon asked Preston to clarify exactly how quickly that sum had vanished. Preston's knees finally gave out. He collapsed onto the edge of the glass coffee table, burying his face in his hands. Amidst racking sobs, the entire horrific confession spilled out into the room. Preston sobbed that Valerie's lifestyle demands were completely suffocating him. The exclusive country club, dues, the luxury cars, the endless designer shopping sprees. He wanted to give her the world, but he did not possess the genuine talent to build a real company from scratch. Instead of using my $600,000 to secure a commercial lease and hire staff, he saw an opportunity for a massive, instantaneous return. He dumped every single penny of my hard-earned capital into highly volatile, unregulated cryptocurrency day trading. He foolishly believed he could quadruple the money in weeks, secure his wealth, and build the company later. The decentralized market had crashed violently just weeks after he initiated the trades. He was entirely over-leveraged on margin calls. The $600,000 had been completely liquidated, wiped out by unforgiving digital algorithms. He had absolutely nothing left to show for my massive investment, only a fake virtual mailbox and a trail of profound lies. I sat in my dark motel room, my hands gripping the desk so tightly my knuckles turned white. The phantom startup was not merely a failed business venture. It was an illegal gambling fund. My son had taken my life savings and thrown it onto a digital roulette table to appease his incredibly arrogant wife. The profound disgust washing over me was sickening. But Damon was not finished. He stood up from the white sofa, smoothing out the invisible wrinkles in his expensive suit. The conversation immediately shifted from the lost $600,000 to a much more terrifying sum. Damon coldly reminded Preston that losing his father's money, it was a personal family tragedy. But losing Damon's money was a fatal business error. When the cryptocurrency market crashed, Preston desperately attempted to cover his massive margin calls and avoid total liquidation. In absolute blind panic, he sought out underground high-risk financial channels. He approached Damon's illicit associates, borrowing heavily against his fabricated corporate assets and upscale suburban home. Damon clearly stated the exact outstanding balance, enunciating every single syllable for maximum psychological impact. $2 million. Preston had borrowed a staggering $2 million in dirty money to chase his digital losses, and he completely lost that capital as well. The horrific magnitude of his financial crimes was beyond human comprehension. Preston dropped to the floor, kneeling on the expensive rug, openly weeping and begging for his life. He frantically offered to sell the house, to sell Valerie's cars, to liquidate every possession he owned, to make Damon whole. Damon walked slowly around the coffee table, stopping directly in front of the kneeling man. He looked down at Preston with an expression of pure contempt. He quietly explained that selling a property encumbered by massive federal tax liens was legally impossible. The IRS was already circling the house. Damon's organization required liquid cash, not compromised real estate. The underground lender delivered his final uncompromising ultimatum with chilling composure. He gave Preston exactly 48 hours to procure the $2 million. If the full balance plus the exorbitant compounding interest was not deposited into their offshore holding accounts by midnight on Saturday, Damon promised to return. He explicitly stated the next visit would not involve polite conversation. He promised to start dismantling Preston's life piece by piece. He casually mentioned Valerie sleeping blissfully upstairs, noting how truly tragic it would be if something horrific were to happen to such a beautiful, high-maintenance woman. Damon turned and walked smoothly toward the heavy oak front door of the house. He did not look back. He exited the house, the door clicking shut behind him with terrible finality. Preston remained curled on the floor, weeping uncontrollably into the rug, a man completely destroyed by his own catastrophic greed. I stared at the digital feed, the glowing screen illuminating my grim face. The harsh, brutal truth was entirely exposed, and I knew exactly what I had to do next. I reached for my mobile phone, fully prepared to call Mitchell and initiate a brutal legal war, but the digital video feed suddenly demanded my immediate attention. The heavy oak door had barely clicked shut when Preston scrambled to his feet like a madman. He lunged toward the foyer, throwing the door open and crying out into the dark night, begging Damon to wait just one more minute. Through the camera feed, I watched the shadowy figure of the underworld lender pause on the front walkway. Damon slowly turned around, his posture radiating extreme annoyance. He stepped back over the threshold, his polished shoes tapping against the hardwood floor. He warned Preston that his patience was entirely exhausted and that this had better be a conversation worth having. Preston was hyperventilating, wiping tears and sweat from his face with the sleeves of his ruined shirt. He frantically gestured toward the hallway, pleading with Damon to follow him back into the private study. He babbled that he had collateral, real tangible assets that were worth far more than the $2 million he owed the syndicate. Damon raised a skeptical eyebrow, but followed my son down the hall. I quickly shifted my attention to the second camera feed, the one mounted directly above Preston's massive mahogany desk. The digital image was sharp, capturing every single detail of the room. Preston rushed behind his desk and practically threw himself into his leather executive chair. He unlocked the bottom drawer with shaking hands and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of manila folders. He slammed them down onto the polished wood surface, his breathing ragged and shallow. Damon stood on the opposite side of the desk, crossing his arms over his chest, looking entirely unimpressed. He asked Preston what kind of useless garbage he was trying to peddle now. Preston frantically opened the top folder, spreading the documents out under the bright beam of his desk lamp. He pointed a trembling finger at the paperwork, his voice rising in pitch as he desperately tried to sell his final horrific lifeline. He told Damon that the papers were the fully authenticated original property deeds to a massive commercial and residential real estate portfolio. He claimed the primary asset alone was independently appraised at over $5 million. I leaned closer to my laptop screen in the dark motel room, my eyes narrowing as I tried to read the text on the documents. The pristine camera feed allowed me to zoom in perfectly. When the bold black lettering came into focus, my heart completely stopped beating in my chest. The documents spread across Preston's desk were the official, legally binding property deeds to my primary family estate. It was the sprawling home where I had raised my children, the property I had spent 40 years paying off and renovating with my own two hands. It was Martha's safe haven. Preston was standing there in the middle of the night, actively offering his own mother and father's home to a violent criminal syndicate. Damon leaned over the desk, scrutinizing the paperwork with a cold, calculating eye. He noted that the primary name on the property deeds was Harrison Caldwell. He looked up at Preston, stating very clearly that collateral only works if the person offering it actually owns the asset. He asked Preston how he intended to sign over a $5 million estate that legally belonged to his father. Preston let out a sickening, desperate laugh. It was the sound of a man completely unhinged from morality. He reached into the second folder and pulled out a stack of notarized transfer agreements and power of attorney declarations. He pushed them across the desk toward Damon. He proudly explained that he had spent the last 3 months meticulously studying my signature from old birthday cards and discarded business contracts. Through the audio feed, I listened in absolute horror as my son eagerly detailed his ultimate treason. He bragged about how easy it was to manipulate the system when you share the same last name and have intimate knowledge of your father's personal scheduling. He had legally duplicated the property deeds and hired a completely corrupt, unlicensed notary public from the city's south side to falsely authenticate the transfer documents. He had forged my signature perfectly on every single page. He had effectively stolen my home right out from under me without me ever knowing a thing. He pointed to the bottom of the power of attorney agreement, showing Damon the exact spot where he had flawlessly replicated my distinct cursive handwriting. He told Damon that, legally speaking, he now possessed full and unencumbered authority to liquidate, mortgage, or transfer the $5 million estate without requiring any further consent from me. Preston smiled a grotesque, sweaty grin and told the criminal lender that the property was completely free of any existing mortgages or bank liens. He offered the entire estate to Damon right then and there permanently, signing over the collateral to cover his massive cryptocurrency debts and save his own miserable life. Damon picked up the forged transfer agreements, holding them up to the light of the desk lamp. He studied the fraudulent signatures and the fake notary stamps with quiet intensity. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound in the study was the soft rustling of the stolen documents. I sat frozen in my motel chair, a cold, suffocating numbness spreading through my veins. The initial anger I had felt over the missing venture capital and the $600,000 completely evaporated, replaced by a devastating, profound heartbreak. This was no longer just about financial incompetence or maintaining a lavish lifestyle for Valerie. This was pure, unadulterated evil. My own flesh and blood, the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle, the man I had proudly funded, was willingly sacrificing his parents' security to save his own skin. He was throwing Martha and me directly to the wolves, essentially making us homeless, just so he could avoid facing the violent consequences of his own reckless gambling. Damon finally lowered the papers and dropped them back onto the mahogany desk. A slow, cruel smirk spread across his face. He told my son that he was incredibly resourceful when his life was on the line. Damon accepted the collateral. He stated that the syndicate would place a quiet, immediate lien against the massive $5 million estate using the forged documents. He gave Preston a temporary reprieve. He explained that if the $2 million was not fully paid back within 90 days, the syndicate would legally foreclose on my home, evict my wife and me without mercy, and liquidate the property to settle the debt. He warned Preston that the syndicate did not care about innocent bystanders. If they had to throw an old couple out onto the street, they would do it with absolute pleasure. Preston vehemently agreed to the terms, vigorously nodding his head and thanking Damon profusely for the extension. He promised he would figure out a way to get the missing cash, swearing that his parents would never even know a lien had been placed on their home. Preston let out a dry sob. He wiped his sweaty forehead, trying to regain some pathetic semblance of dignity in front of the criminal who held his entire life in his hands. He pushed the forged property deeds across the mahogany desk, officially sealing the fraudulent transaction. Seeking a moment to compose his shattered nerves, Preston eagerly offered Damon a glass of aged scotch to formally commemorate their temporary arrangement. Damon smirked, leaning back into the plush leather executive chair, and casually waved his hand in agreement. Preston practically tripped over his own feet as he scrambled out from behind the desk. He rushed out of the private study, his hurried footsteps echoing down the long, carpeted hallway. I sat perfectly still in the dim glow of my motel room, my eyes rigidly fixed on the glowing laptop screen. Through the primary surveillance camera mounted directly above the desk, I watched Damon casually pick up the forged transfer documents. He flipped through the stolen pages, a look of profound amusement dancing across his sharp features. He was completely alone in the silent room, admiring the absolute ease with which he had just acquired a massive $5 million suburban estate. I was just about to shift my visual focus to the secondary camera feed, tracking the hallway, expecting to monitor Preston returning with the drinks, when the heavy oak door of the study silently swung open. Valerie stepped into the visual frame of the digital recording. I instantly tensed my hands, gripping the edge of the flimsy laminate desk. According to Preston, his wife was supposedly upstairs in the master bedroom, paralyzed by overwhelming social anxiety and crying herself to sleep. The woman walking into the study was not crying, and she certainly was not asleep. She was wearing an elegant, flowing silk robe. Her hair was perfectly styled, and her face was a mask of cold, calculating composure. I fully expected her to scream, to demand to know who this dangerous stranger was sitting behind her husband's desk. I braced myself for the inevitable confrontation. Valerie did not scream. She did not look surprised. She closed the wooden door behind her with a soft, deliberate click, ensuring it was completely shut. She turned around, and a slow, incredibly wicked smile spread across her flawless face. She walked purposefully across the oriental rug, bypassing the guest chairs entirely, and moved directly to the side of the mahogany desk where Damon was sitting. Damon did not stand up. He did not reach for a weapon. He simply looked up at her, matching her wicked smile with a predatory grin of his own. Valerie leaned down, wrapped her arms intimately around his neck, and kissed him passionately, right there in her husband's private sanctuary. The shock of the visual image hit me with the force of a freight train. My breath caught sharply in my throat. I leaned dangerously close to the laptop screen, completely mesmerized by the sheer magnitude of the unfolding horror. Damon pulled her down onto his lap, his hands resting comfortably on her waist. Valerie let out a soft laugh, completely devoid of the hysterical panic she had displayed in my truck just 24 hours earlier. She ran her manicured fingers through Damon's dark hair and asked him in a hushed whisper if her foolish husband had finally signed the necessary paperwork. Damon reached over, picked up the forged property deeds, and proudly held them up for her to see. He told her that Preston had performed exactly as predicted, offering his father's entire estate to save his own skin. Through the sensitive audio microphone hidden in the ventilation grate, I listened to a conversation that completely shattered every assumption I held about the situation. Valerie eagerly inspected the fraudulent documents, her eyes shining with absolute greed. She praised Damon for playing his part flawlessly, noting how terrifying he looked when he delivered the final ultimatum. Damon laughed quietly, crediting her for laying the perfect groundwork. The horrific truth poured out through their hushed, deeply arrogant dialogue. Preston was not the mastermind behind this massive financial collapse. Preston was nothing more than a pathetic, manipulated pawn in an incredibly elaborate, deeply malicious game. Valerie had orchestrated the entire downfall from the very beginning. When Preston deposited my $600,000 investment into his corporate accounts, Valerie recognized an opportunity to secure her own immense wealth. She confessed to Damon that she intentionally fed Preston fraudulent financial advice. She purposefully introduced him to volatile cryptocurrency day trading, convincing his ego that he could easily quadruple his father's money and become a legendary venture capitalist overnight. She knew his arrogance would blind him to the obvious dangers. When the digital markets crashed and Preston lost every penny of my investment, he was completely desperate and terrified of my reaction. That was when Valerie executed the second phase of her brilliant trap. She deliberately steered her panicked husband toward Damon's underground lending syndicate. She convinced Preston that borrowing $2 million from illicit sources was his only viable option to cover his massive margin calls and secretly rebuild his vanished startup. She knew perfectly well that Damon's interest rates were designed to be completely insurmountable. She knew Preston would rapidly default on the loan. The ultimate goal was never to salvage the fake technology company. The goal was always to back Preston into such a terrifying corner that he would willingly sacrifice his greatest remaining asset, my $5 million family estate. Valerie and Damon had colluded to systematically bankrupt my son, strictly to force him to forge my signature and surrender the property deeds directly into their greedy hands. Valerie traced a finger over the fake notary stamp, casually mentioning that once the syndicate foreclosed on the stolen property and liquidated the estate, she would take her generous cut of the profits, file for a public divorce citing Preston's hidden gambling debts, and walk away a wealthy, unencumbered woman. She called Preston a useful idiot, a man so blinded by his desperate need to appear successful that he handed her the keys to a multi-million-dollar fortune. She kissed Damon again, whispering that they had maybe 2 more minutes before the fool returned. She quickly stood up, smoothed out her silk robe, and promised to call Damon tomorrow morning to finalize the foreclosure timeline. She slipped quietly out of the study, disappearing down the dark hallway, just moments before Preston came rushing back into the room, holding a silver tray with a crystal decanter and 2 glasses. I sat frozen in the cramped motel room, absolute silence wrapping around me like a heavy blanket. The glowing laptop screen felt like a portal into hell. My son was a traitor, a liar, and a thief, but he was also a tragically gullible victim of his own vanity. Valerie was the true architect of our destruction. The anger inside my chest completely crystallized into something cold, hard, and terrifyingly precise. I knew exactly what I had to do next, and it would destroy them both. Preston hurried back into the study, the crystal decanter rattling against the 2 glasses on the silver tray. He was completely out of breath, his face flushed with cheap alcohol and sheer panic. He set the tray down on the mahogany desk and clumsily poured the amber liquid, failing to notice the smug, predatory look still lingering on Damon's face. Preston handed a glass to the underground lender, practically bowing in submission. Damon accepted the drink with a slow, deliberate nod, offering a toast to their financial partnership. Preston drank his scotch in one gulp, seeking refuge from the terrifying reality he had created. I watched through the digital feed as my son poured himself another drink and then another. The crushing weight of the federal seizure, noticed the cryptocurrency losses, and the looming threat of the violent syndicate were too much for his mind to process. Within 20 minutes, the heavy consumption of premium liquor took its toll. Preston began slurring his words, his posture failing. He slumped forward, his cheek pressing against the polished wood of the desk right next to the fraudulent property deeds that sealed his doom. His eyes fluttered shut, and the breathing of a drunken stupor filled the quiet room. Damon watched him pass out with an expression of pure disgust. He placed his half-empty glass on the silver tray, reached across the desk, and collected the forged transfer documents. He folded them neatly, slipping them into the inner pocket of his suit. Damon turned his back on my unconscious son and walked out of the study. I shifted my attention away from the desk camera and clicked onto the living room feed on my laptop screen. The display illuminated the modern space in sharp detail. Valerie had not gone upstairs to bed. She was waiting in the shadows near the entryway, leaning against the stone fireplace with a glass of wine in her hand. Damon walked down the hallway and stepped into the living room, moving with the grace of a predator returning to its mate. Valerie placed her wine glass on the mantel and stepped into his arms. The audio receiver caught the soft rustle of her silk robe as they embraced. She looked up at him, her eyes devoid of the panic she wore around my son. She asked Damon in a hushed whisper if the pathetic fool had handed over the final signatures. Damon patted the breast pocket of his suit, confirming he had the forged property deeds in his possession. He told Valerie that Preston was passed out on his desk, oblivious to the world. Valerie let out a laugh, a sound that made my blood run cold. She asked Damon for the timeline, her voice tight with anticipation. Damon pulled her closer, his voice dropping to a murmur. He explained that his associates were already processing the fraudulent paperwork through their banking channels. He assured her that the $2 million loan secured by the lien against my family estate would be washed and cleared into their offshore shadow accounts by Friday afternoon. Valerie smiled, running her hands down the lapels of his expensive suit. She announced that she had already finalized their travel arrangements. She told Damon she had booked 2 first-class tickets on a flight heading to Geneva, Switzerland. She had utilized the alias passports that Damon had provided her weeks ago. Their getaway plan was structured, ruthless, and dependent on the destruction of my family. I sat in my dark motel room, my hands shaking with absolute clarity. I listened as Valerie outlined the catastrophic fallout they were leaving behind. She asked Damon to confirm the legal trap they had set for Preston. Damon smiled, explaining the cruelty of their setup. He detailed how he had intentionally structured the corrupt notary logs and the forged paper trail to ensure every piece of evidence pointed exclusively to Preston. When the federal investigators tore the financial records apart, they would find zero trace of Damon or his syndicate. They would only find Preston Caldwell, a desperate executive who forged his father's signature to secure millions in illegal funding. Damon promised Valerie that Preston would face a federal indictment for wire fraud, tax evasion, and grand larceny. My son would spend the best years of his life rotting inside a federal penitentiary, taking the total blame for a conspiracy he never understood. Valerie sighed with satisfaction, untroubled by the fate awaiting her husband. She then turned the conversation toward the final piece of their puzzle. She brought up Martha and me. Valerie laughed softly, taking a slow sip of her wine. She told Damon how poetic it was that the arrogant old man who judged her spending habits was about to lose everything he owned. She asked Damon exactly how quickly the syndicate would legally foreclose on the $5 million property. Damon replied with chilling indifference. He stated that the second the shadow accounts registered the $2 million deposit on Friday afternoon, his lawyers would file the default paperwork. He promised Valerie that the legal eviction notice would be nailed directly to my front door by Monday morning. He described how my wife and I would be thrown out onto the street, our estate liquidated to permanently close the fraudulent ledger. Valerie smiled, expressing her sincere hope that my wife and I ended up completely homeless and destitute. She kissed Damon passionately once again, a final pact between two monsters. The sheer audacity of their getaway plan left me breathless. I had spent 40 years building a life of integrity, working long shifts to ensure my family never had to worry about their financial security. I had paid for Preston's expensive college tuition. I had funded his wedding to Valerie. I had handed him $600,000 in good faith to build his professional dreams. And in return for a lifetime of unconditional support, they were actively plotting to steal my home frame, my only son, for federal fraud and flee to a foreign country with the profits. They were perfectly content to leave Martha and me to die in the cold. It was a level of sociopathic greed that defied all human comprehension. Damon pulled away, offering a nod. He promised to meet her at the private terminal at 4 o'clock on Friday. He turned around, opened the door, and walked out into the night. Valerie stood alone in the living room, her face glowing with the promise of stolen wealth. She picked up her glass, turned off the lights, and walked slowly up the stairs, leaving her husband in the study below. I reached forward and stopped the recording on my laptop, the screen freezing on the empty room. The anger inside me vanished, replaced by a focus. They thought they had orchestrated the perfect crime. They believed they were fleeing to Geneva with millions of stolen dollars while my family burned to the ground. I closed the laptop, the dark room matching the cold resolve solidifying in my chest. I had the confession preserved on a server. I had 70 hours to dismantle their lives. The time for observation was over. The time for observation was over. I did not shed a single tear in the suffocating darkness of that cheap motel room. I did not scream, and I did not punch the peeling walls in a fit of rage. The agonizing heartbreak of a father losing his only son had completely burned away, leaving behind nothing but the chilling, calculating precision of a man who had spent 4 decades building a commercial monopoly from the ground up. I closed the laptop screen, severing the digital connection to my desecrated home. I packed the specialized surveillance equipment back into my canvas tool bag with deliberate movements. I walked out into the cool night air, the neon motel sign buzzing above my head, and climbed into the cab of my truck. I pointed my vehicle toward the towering glass and steel skyline of downtown Chicago. I reached into my coat pocket and dialed a private number I reserved strictly for corporate emergencies. It was 2:30 in the morning, but Mitchell Reed answered on the second ring. Mitchell was my oldest friend, my fiercest legal defender, and a senior partner at the most ruthless law firm in the state. I kept my voice perfectly level and informed him that my son and my daughter-in-law had just finalized a conspiracy to commit bank fraud, forge the deeds to my primary estate, and flee the country with millions belonging to a violent criminal syndicate. The heavy silence on the line lasted for exactly 3 seconds. Mitchell did not ask if I was sure. He knew my temperament perfectly. He told me to meet him at his downtown office in exactly 30 minutes and instructed me to bring every single piece of digital evidence I had collected. When I arrived at the corporate high-rise, the lobby was deserted, except for a security guard who nodded me through the express elevators. I rode to the 42nd floor in silence. Mitchell was waiting in his corner office, fully dressed in a tailored suit, his eyes betraying no hint of sleep. He was not alone. Sitting around his mahogany conference table were 3 men and 1 woman in crisp suits. Mitchell introduced them. They were senior field agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specifically assigned to the Elite Financial Crimes Division. Mitchell had contacted the regional director the second I hung up, utilizing decades of high-level favors to pull them out of bed. The lead agent, an imposing man named Agent Harris, shook my hand firmly and asked me to sit. I did not waste their time with emotional preamble. I opened my bag, placed my laptop in the center of the table, and entered my encryption keys. I connected the device to the digital display on the wall and pressed play on the compiled footage. For the next 45 minutes, the experts sat in stunned silence as the horror played out in vivid high definition. I showed them the initial footage of Preston weeping, confessing to losing $600,000 of my money in illegal cryptocurrency trades. I showed them Damon, the notorious underworld lender, delivering his violent ultimatum and threatening to harm my family if the $2 million debt was not settled. The FBI agents exchanged knowing glances when Damon's face filled the screen. They recognized him instantly as a high-value target they had been trying to nail for years. The truly devastating moment arrived when I played the final sequence from the study. The agents watched in disgusted fascination as Valerie entered the room, passionately kissed the loan shark, and callously outlined her malicious master plan. They listened to the audio as Valerie and Damon laughed about framing my son for federal wire fraud, destroying my $5 million estate, and confirming their flight to Geneva on Friday afternoon. When the video faded to black, the silence in the room was heavy. Agent Harris took off his glasses and looked at me with an expression of profound respect. He stated that in 20 years of investigating elite corporate fraud, he had never been handed a more perfectly wrapped, airtight criminal conviction. I pushed my laptop forward, telling the agents that the video and audio files were only the beginning. Using the sophisticated tracking software I had installed on my secure cloud server, I had managed to capture the digital handshake between Preston's home network and Damon's mobile device. I handed Agent Harris a printed dossier containing the exact internet protocol, addresses, the encrypted routing numbers, and the digital pathways leading directly to Damon's offshore shadow accounts. I had provided the federal government with the precise financial roadmap to dismantle the entire illegal syndicate. The female agent immediately opened her secure terminal, furiously typing the routing numbers into the federal database tracing the vast web of hidden illicit funds. Mitchell then leaned forward, steepling his fingers on the table. He looked at Agent Harris and stated that while the FBI prepared their massive criminal indictments for Friday, we needed to completely secure my personal assets immediately. Preston had perfectly forged my signature on a complete set of authentic property deeds, and Damon's corrupt notary was prepared to process the illegal transfer by the end of the week. Mitchell smiled, an expression that perfectly matched my own internal resolve. He explained his countermeasure. We were not going to stop Damon's associates from submitting the forged property deeds to the county. We were going to let them walk directly into a legal trap. Under the direct supervision of the agents, Mitchell drafted an emergency, highly classified injunction. We placed an absolute legal lock on my $5 million estate. The property title was officially flagged within the federal registry, protected by a specialized alert system utilized for active domestic terrorism investigations. Mitchell explained the mechanics of the trap. On Friday afternoon, when Damon's legal team attempted to file the forged transfer documents to secure the $2 million lien, the transaction would not be rejected. Instead, the local county system would seamlessly accept the paperwork, simultaneously triggering a silent, massive federal alarm directly to Agent Harris's desk. The very act of filing the fraudulent deed would instantly cross the threshold from an attempted crime into an actionable federal felony. Damon, Valerie, and my foolish son would believe their plan was proceeding flawlessly, entirely unaware that the net had closed tightly around them. I signed the classified injunction paperwork with a steady hand, feeling the solid weight of justice settling into place. We finalized the operational timeline as the morning sun began to rise over the Chicago skyline. Damon and Valerie planned to flee the country on a private flight to Geneva on Friday afternoon. Preston believed he was simply securing a temporary extension on his massive debts. They were all marching blindly toward their own absolute ruin. I thanked Mitchell and the agents for their unprecedented speed and unwavering support. I closed my laptop, packed my canvas bag, and walked out of the high-rise. I climbed back into my truck, watching the city awaken around me. The pieces were perfectly aligned. The trap was permanently set. I just had to wait for Friday. Thursday evening arrived with a heavy, humid warmth that clung to the Chicago suburbs. I pulled my dusty truck into Preston and Valerie's pristine driveway precisely at 7 in the evening. I had spent the afternoon meticulously distressing my clothes, ensuring my flannel shirt smelled faintly of wood smoke and pine needles. I had even purchased a cheap cooler and filled it with melted ice and a few trout to sell the illusion of my remote fishing trip. I walked up the manicured stone pathway carrying the cooler and wearing the wide, oblivious smile of a retired man returning from a peaceful vacation. I rang the doorbell, knowing exactly what kind of monsters waited on the other side. Preston opened the door almost immediately. He was wearing a freshly pressed designer shirt, his hair perfectly styled, but the deep dark circles under his eyes betrayed the sheer terror consuming his waking hours. He pulled me into a tight, desperate hug, greeting me with an exaggerated enthusiasm that made my stomach churn. He loudly welcomed me home, asking a barrage of questions about the cabin and the weather in northern Michigan. I played my part flawlessly. I laughed heartily, clapping him on the shoulder, and complained about the terrible road conditions and the complete lack of cell phone reception. I told him that Martha had decided to stay an extra day in Wisconsin, with her sister enjoying the quiet time while I drove back alone to check on the house. Preston eagerly swallowed the lie, visibly relieved that he only had to maintain his charade for one parent tonight. Valerie glided into the grand foyer, holding a glass of expensive red wine. She wore a stunning silk dress, her face a mask of absolute radiant hospitality. She smiled warmly, stepping forward to kiss my cheek. The scent of her expensive perfume was suffocating. I looked into her beautiful, calculating eyes, knowing perfectly well that just 2 nights ago she had passionately kissed a violent loan shark in her husband's study. I knew she had orchestrated my son's financial ruin, manipulated him into massive underworld debt, and plotted to leave my wife and me entirely homeless. Yet I returned her smile with genuine warmth. I thanked her for the invitation, playing the role of the incredibly grateful, simple father. They escorted me into the formal dining room. The long mahogany table was set with their finest crystal and imported porcelain. Valerie had ordered a lavish catered feast from one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city. There were massive platters of roasted lamb, truffled potatoes, and delicate asparagus. It was a feast designed to placate a foolish old man, a final grand gesture of false family unity, before they executed their ultimate treason. I sat at the head of the table, unfolding my linen napkin with slow, deliberate movements. I looked around the beautifully decorated room, marveling at the sheer audacity of their performance. Throughout the extravagant dinner, the conversation was a masterpiece of absolute deception. Preston poured my wine with shaking hands, nervously asking about my upcoming retirement plans. I leaned back in my chair, adopting the persona of a tired, technologically illiterate boomer. I told them that I was simply looking forward to tending my garden and completely ignoring the modern world. I purposely complained about how confusing mobile banking apps had become, claiming I still preferred to use physical paper checks and balance my checkbook by hand. Valerie let out a soft, melodic laugh, exchanging a rapid, knowing glance with Preston. It was a look of pure, unadulterated condescension. She gently patted my hand across the table, telling me that I had earned the right to relax and leave the complicated financial matters to the younger generation. She assured me that Preston was handling their investments brilliantly and that their future was incredibly secure. I smiled back at her, chewing my roasted lamb, acutely aware that their supposedly secure future was entirely dependent on framing my son for federal wire fraud and fleeing to Geneva on a private flight tomorrow afternoon. Preston eagerly jumped into the conversation, his voice tight with suppressed anxiety. He boasted about a massive new venture capital deal he was finalizing on Friday. He claimed his software company was about to receive a massive historic dollar valuation from a prestigious European investment firm. He described the fictitious European investors in great detail, unknowingly validating the exact getaway timeline I had recorded in his study. I nodded slowly, projecting absolute paternal pride. I told him how incredibly proud his mother and I were of his tremendous success. I praised his business acumen, deliberately feeding his fragile ego, watching him desperately try to believe his own elaborate lies. Every bite of food tasted like ash in my mouth, but I never let my mask slip for a single second. I asked Valerie about her country club events, actively listening, as she cheerfully described a charity gala she was supposedly planning for next month. She lied with such effortless grace, painting a vivid picture of a future she had absolutely no intention of sticking around to see. I watched her sip her wine, completely mesmerized by the dark, malicious void hiding behind her beautiful face. She was a true predator, perfectly adapted to her luxurious suburban environment, feeding on the weak insecurities of the man sitting next to her. As the dinner finally concluded, Preston stood up to clear the expensive dishes. I remained at the table with Valerie. She leaned forward, resting her chin on her hands, and asked me if I ever worried about the legacy I was leaving behind. She phrased it as an innocent philosophical question, but I knew the sinister intent behind her words. She was silently mocking me, knowing that she was actively attempting to steal my life savings and completely destroy my family name. I maintained my calm, friendly demeanor. I told her that a man's true legacy is not measured by the money he leaves in a bank account, but by the integrity he instills in his children. I looked her directly in the eyes and stated that the truth always reveals itself eventually. For a fraction of a second, her perfect smile faltered, a tiny crack in her flawless facade, but she quickly recovered. Preston returned from the kitchen, suggesting we move to the living room for coffee. I politely declined, stretching my arms and faking a deep, exhausting yawn. I told them that the long drive had completely worn me out, and that I needed to get home to prepare for Martha's return. Preston looked incredibly relieved. He walked me to the front door, handing me my cheap cooler. He pulled me into one final, desperate hug. He told me he loved me, his voice cracking slightly, with the unbearable weight of his impending treason. I patted his back, feeling the cold, rigid tension in his shoulders. I told him I loved him too, and that I was eagerly looking forward to hearing about his investment tomorrow. Valerie stood in the doorway, waving gracefully as I walked down the stone path. I simply drove my truck away. The drive back to my quiet suburban house felt incredibly surreal. The city lights blurred past my windshield as I navigated the empty midnight highways, leaving behind the luxurious deception of Lincoln Park. I had perfectly executed my role as the clueless, trusting father. Preston and Valerie were currently sleeping under the immense delusion that their catastrophic treason was proceeding exactly as planned. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the house was dark and silent. Martha was still safely in Wisconsin, entirely shielded from the radioactive fallout that was about to consume our family. I walked into my private home office, turned on the small brass desk lamp, and unlocked the heavy steel safe bolted into the floorboards. I pulled out a thick blue manila folder. Mitchell Reed, my ruthless corporate attorney, had handed me this specific folder during our early morning meeting at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Inside was a stack of highly specialized legal documents. They were masterfully engineered dummy papers. They looked exactly like standard property transfer authorizations. The formatting, the legal jargon, and the heavy watermarks were flawless replicas. However, embedded deep within the dense contractual clauses was language that completely nullified the transaction, instantly flagging any attempt to file them as a direct violation of the federal lock we had placed on my estate. I meticulously folded these dummy documents and slid them into the inner breast pocket of my heavy wool coat. I knew Valerie and Preston would inevitably make one final desperate move to secure my authentic signature before their scheduled flight to Geneva. I sat in my leather chair, watching the morning sun slowly crest over the horizon, painting the suburban sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold. At exactly 8 o'clock, my mobile phone buzzed on the polished mahogany desk. The caller identification displayed Valerie's name. I let it ring 3 times, controlling my breathing before answering with a warm, gravelly voice. Valerie sounded exceptionally cheerful, her tone dripping with an artificial sweetness that made my skin crawl. She asked if I had slept well after my long drive from the fishing cabin. I assured her I was perfectly rested. She then casually mentioned that their joint accountant had flagged a few minor discrepancies on last year's family tax returns. She framed it as a completely mundane bureaucratic annoyance. She told me she had the corrected adjustment forms printed out and desperately needed my physical signature before the county tax office closed for the weekend. She suggested we meet for a quick morning coffee at a quiet, upscale cafe situated exactly halfway between our houses. It was a masterful performance. She injected just the right amount of apologetic stress into her voice. I smiled coldly at the dark wall of my office. I told her I would be absolutely delighted to help her clear up the paperwork, confirming I would meet her at the cafe in 30 minutes. I hung up the phone, stood up, and patted the breast pocket of my coat. The dummy documents were perfectly concealed. The final act of their malicious play was officially commencing. I drove to the cafe, a trendy establishment filled with soft jazz music and the rich aroma of roasted espresso beans. Valerie was already seated at a secluded corner table near the back, entirely shielded from the main windows. She looked immaculate, wearing a tailored beige trench coat and oversized designer sunglasses pushed up into her perfectly styled hair. She was sipping a sparkling water, looking every bit the wealthy, untroubled socialite. I approached the table with a slow, slightly stiff gait, maintaining the illusion of an aging man. She stood up, greeting me with a bright smile and a brief hollow embrace. I sat down heavily in the wrought iron chair across from her, ordering a simple black coffee from the passing waiter. Valerie did not waste any time engaging in meaningless small talk. The moment my coffee arrived, she reached into her large, expensive leather handbag. She pulled out a thick stack of stapled papers and slid them smoothly across the polished marble table. She tapped the top page, letting out an exasperated sigh. She smoothly explained that the county assessor needed my explicit authorization to recalibrate the property tax boundaries between our adjacent family trust accounts. I pulled my reading glasses from my shirt pocket and slowly placed them on my face. I looked down at the documents. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my hands remained incredibly steady. I instantly recognized the dense legal formatting. These were absolutely not routine tax adjustment forms. These were the final, irrevocable authorization releases required by Damon's underground syndicate. Preston had forged my signature on the initial collateral deeds, but the shadow banks required a live secondary verification to permanently bind my $5 million estate to their illicit $2 million loan. Valerie was sitting right across from me, calmly asking me to sign away my entire life savings so she could flee to Switzerland with a violent loan shark. I nodded slowly, pretending to struggle with the complex legal terminology. I muttered something about how complicated modern banking had become, deliberately projecting a sense of complete, helpless confusion. Valerie smiled reassuringly, a predatory glint flashing in her beautiful eyes. She leaned forward, pointing directly to the 3 blank signature lines highlighted with bright yellow sticky notes. She softly encouraged me to simply sign the highlighted sections, promising she would personally deliver them to the county clerk and handle all the boring administrative details. I picked up the silver pen she gracefully offered. I hovered the tip over the first signature line. I looked up at her, my expression completely innocent. I told her that I had foolishly left my primary identification card in the locked glove compartment of my heavy truck and asked if the strict county tax office would legally require a physical copy of my valid driver license to properly process the financial adjustments. Valerie frowned, her perfect facade cracking for a microscopic moment as panic momentarily gripped her features. She desperately needed this transaction to be flawless. She quickly looked down at her own handbag, rummaging through her perfectly organized wallet to check the notary requirements. In that exact fraction of a second, while her eyes were completely diverted, I executed the maneuver I had mentally rehearsed all morning. I seamlessly slid the fraudulent syndicate documents off the marble table, dropping them silently onto the empty chair beside me. I pulled the dummy documents from the inner pocket of my heavy wool coat and placed them squarely on the table. The entire swap took less than 2 seconds. It was a flawlessly executed sleight of hand born from absolute, terrifying necessity. When Valerie finally looked back up, her composed smile firmly back in place, she was staring directly at the federal trap Mitchell had explicitly designed. I signed my name on the 3 highlighted dummy pages, handing the pen back to her. Valerie eagerly snatched the documents off the table, sliding them triumphantly into her expensive bag. She thanked me profusely, completely unaware that she had just permanently sealed her own catastrophic doom. Friday evening descended upon the city with a heavy electric energy. The long, deeply agonizing wait was finally over, and the intricate trap I had carefully laid was primed to snap shut. Valerie was hosting her highly anticipated charity gala at one of the most extravagant hotels in downtown Chicago. She had booked the grand ballroom months in advance, utilizing the last remaining fragments of Preston's stolen money to cement her fabricated image of immense wealth and profound social importance. It was her grand finale, a glittering curtain call designed to blind the local aristocracy before she vanished into the midnight sky on a flight to Geneva. I deliberately parked my large truck exactly 3 blocks away from the hotel, completely avoiding the long line of luxury vehicles waiting for the valet service. I did not change into a tailored tuxedo. I wore the exact same faded flannel shirt, denim jeans, and scuffed leather work boots I had worn during my fabricated fishing trip. I walked through the massive gilded front doors, my heavy boots thudding softly against the pristine marble floors of the grand lobby. The contrast between my rugged, weathered appearance and the absolute overwhelming opulence of the event was jarring. I handed my generic paper ticket to the uniformed attendant standing at the entrance of the grand ballroom. He looked at my worn clothing with sheer disdain before stepping aside to let me pass. I walked into a sea of glittering diamonds, tailored silk, and the overwhelming scent of imported perfumes. The ballroom was a masterpiece of excessive indulgence. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceiling, casting a bright, brilliant light over dozens of tables, draped in heavy white linen. Waiters in crisp uniforms navigated smoothly through the dense crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with premium champagne and expensive appetizers. I moved slowly along the perimeter of the vast room, completely and utterly ignored by the wealthy elite of Chicago. To them, I was entirely invisible, just a misplaced old man who had somehow wandered into the wrong building. They did not know that the quiet man in the flannel shirt held the absolute power to destroy the entire fragile foundation of the evening. I found a quiet corner near a massive marble pillar, a perfect vantage point that offered a commanding view of the entire ballroom. My eyes immediately locked onto Valerie. She was radiating in a stunning emerald gown that clung perfectly to her figure. She was the center of attention, floating gracefully from group to group, flashing her hollow smile and accepting endless compliments on her philanthropic efforts. She was playing the role of the socialite with terrifying perfection. She laughed musically at terrible jokes, clinked her crystal glass with prominent local politicians, and graciously accepted massive praise for her supposedly selfless dedication to the charity. Every single smile, every single gesture was a calculated lie. I watched her perform her final masterpiece, knowing that she believed she had completely won the game. She thought my $5 million estate was permanently secured as collateral. She thought the shadow banks were actively processing her illicit funds. She firmly believed that in just a few short hours, she would leave her broken husband behind to rot in a federal penitentiary while she enjoyed total financial freedom in Switzerland. I continued scanning the crowded room, my gaze shifting away from Valerie's dazzling performance to the dark, shadowed edges of the grand ballroom. I spotted him almost instantly. Damon was standing perfectly still near the heavy brass doors of the primary emergency exit. He was dressed in a sleek, completely black suit that absorbed the light from the chandeliers. He did not mingle. He did not accept a drink from the passing waiters. He simply stood there, his posture radiating a quiet, lethal patience. He was watching Valerie with a cold, predatory focus, silently waiting for the clock to strike the designated hour of their escape. Occasionally, Valerie would subtly shift her gaze across the room, making brief, secret eye contact with the underground lender. It was a silent, arrogant confirmation of their shared malicious victory. They were two predators eagerly waiting for the exact moment to abandon their doomed prey. Preston, however, was nowhere near his beautiful, treacherous wife. I finally located my son, sitting alone at a small, isolated table near the back corner of the room, completely hidden behind a towering floral arrangement. He looked absolutely catastrophic. His expensive tuxedo hung loosely on his shrinking frame, and his face was terrifyingly pale and covered in a sheen of nervous sweat. He was holding a glass of dark liquor, his hands trembling so violently that he could barely bring the drink to his lips. He was staring blankly at the polished dance floor, consumed by the crushing gravity of the criminal fraud he believed he had just committed against his own parents. He looked like a man who knew he was walking a tightrope over a bottomless abyss, entirely unaware that the rope had been completely severed days ago. I watched my son slowly drown in his own miserable fear, feeling no pity, only a cold, clinical detachment. The heavy digital watch on my wrist read 8 o'clock in the evening. I knew exactly what was happening miles away in the sterile, heavily fortified offices of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Agent Harris and his elite team of financial experts were currently monitoring the encrypted digital pathways connecting the local county tax office to Damon's offshore shadow accounts. The dummy documents I had swapped onto the marble table at the cafe had been eagerly submitted by Valerie's corrupt notary that afternoon. The federal lock I had placed on my primary estate was currently flashing red across the FBI servers. I stood quietly in the shadows of the grand ballroom, my hands resting comfortably in the pockets of my denim jeans. I did not need to raise my voice. I did not need to cause a massive scene. I simply stood there breathing evenly, watching the illusion of Valerie's perfect life spin out of control. The string quartet playing softly on the raised stage suddenly transitioned into a lively, upbeat tempo. The wealthy guests began moving toward the polished wooden dance floor, their laughter echoing loudly in the massive space. Valerie gracefully accepted the hand of a prominent local judge, allowing him to lead her out under the bright crystal lights. She spun and laughed, her emerald gown catching the light in a mesmerizing display of absolute confidence. She looked toward the exit, flashing a triumphant smile at Damon. Damon checked his heavy gold watch, nodding slowly. They believed they were invincible. They believed they had completely conquered the clueless old man from the suburbs. I leaned back against the cool marble pillar, feeling the weight of justice settling into my bones. The music swelled, filling the room with joyous sound, masking the inevitable approach of federal law enforcement. I took a deep breath, savoring the final moments of their ignorance. Damon shifted his weight, pulling a phone from his pocket and staring intently at the glowing screen. He was waiting for the final confirmation. Damon's phone screen remained dark, the confirmation of his illicit wire transfer delayed by the federal trap, devouring his network. I watched his jaw tighten with impatience, but he quickly smoothed his features, resuming his vigil by the heavy brass doors. Across the grand ballroom, the string quartet faded into elegant silence. A sharply dressed coordinator tapped a crystal glass against a microphone, drawing the attention of the glittering crowd. He introduced the visionary founder of the philanthropic endeavor, asking the elite to welcome Valerie to the stage. Polite applause washed over the room. Valerie gracefully ascended the short stairs to the raised platform, the spotlight catching the emerald silk of her gown. She approached the podium with the practiced humility of a seasoned politician, offering a radiant smile to the guests. She adjusted the microphone with delicate fingers, pausing perfectly to let the applause completely die down. I pushed away from the cold marble pillar, slipping into the shadows along the perimeter. While all eyes were fixed on Valerie, I began my slow walk toward the audiovisual control booth located in the elevated balcony. Valerie's voice echoed through the massive speakers, smooth and dripping with fabricated emotion. She began by praising their commitment to the vulnerable. Then, with an audacity that genuinely astounded me, she transitioned her speech to the importance of family. She spoke about the deep, unbreakable bonds of trust and legacy, regurgitating the sentiments I had shared with her during our dinner 24 hours ago. She claimed that true wealth was not measured by bank accounts, but by the integrity we pass down to the next generation. It was a masterclass in sociopathic deception. I climbed the carpeted spiral staircase to the upper balcony, my boots silenced by the thick fabric. I glanced down through the ornate brass railing. Preston sat alone at his table, his head bowed, cringing at every word his wife spoke. He looked like a prisoner waiting for the executioner, entirely unaware that his executioner was standing on stage, publicly performing her own tragic eulogy. Valerie continued her performance, her voice trembling with perfectly calibrated emotion. She spoke about the profound sacrifices her husband had made to support her dreams, wiping a solitary manufactured tear from her cheek. I reached the top of the stairs and located the heavy door marking the audiovisual control center. I turned the handle and stepped into the small room. A young technician wearing a headset was sitting in front of a massive mixing console surrounded by glowing monitors. He spun around in his chair, his eyes widening in surprise at the intrusion of an old man in a flannel shirt. Before he could utter a word of protest, I pulled out a stack of $100 bills and placed them firmly on his control board. I calmly instructed him to take a very long, quiet coffee break, assuring him that I simply needed to borrow his equipment for a brief family presentation. He slowly took off his headset, scooped the money into his pocket, and silently slipped out, closing the door firmly behind him. I sat in the leather chair and opened my bag. I pulled out my laptop, identifying the main input cables for the ballroom's primary projection system. I connected the heavy cables to my computer, opening the encrypted video file I had prepared. I maximized the video player, ensuring the audio output was routed through the massive concert speakers above the stage. Valerie took a deep breath, leaning into the microphone to deliver her final tearful closing remarks. I reached forward and pulled down the master volume slider on the mixing console. Her voice was instantly and violently severed from the room. The sudden silence was incredibly jarring. Valerie tapped the mesh of her dead microphone, a look of confusion washing over her beautiful features. The guests exchanged bewildered glances, a low murmur of uncertainty rippling through the crowded ballroom. I did not give them a single second to recover. I pressed the enter key on my laptop. Above Valerie's head, the 3 massive projector screens instantly flickered. The elegant charity logo vanished, entirely replaced by the crisp, clear security footage of my son's private study. A collective gasp echoed through the ballroom as the screens illuminated the dark space. The video played in high definition. The entire room watched in horror as the projection showed Valerie gliding into the study, wearing her silk robe, stepping directly into the arms of the underground lender. Damon's face was projected at 20 feet tall. I pushed the volume slider to maximum capacity. Valerie's hushed whisper boomed like thunder from the concert speakers. Every single guest in the ballroom heard her clearly ask Damon if her pathetic fool of a husband had handed over the final signatures. The collective silence of the elite crowd deepened into a suffocating, terrified paralysis. They watched mesmerized as Damon patted his breast pocket and confirmed the acquisition of the forged property deeds. Then Valerie's cruel laughter echoed through the opulent space, a sound so dark it sent a visible shiver through the audience. Her booming voice proudly detailed their exact timeline, verifying the illegal $2 million loan, the shadow accounts, and their private flight to Geneva. The guests listened in sheer disbelief as she explained her malicious trap, laughing about how federal investigators would find zero trace of Damon leaving Preston to take the total blame for the massive conspiracy. She loudly promised that her husband would spend the best years of his life rotting in a federal penitentiary. She bragged about bankrupting her father-in-law, smiling viciously at the thought of leaving me destitute and homeless. I stood quietly in the dark control booth, staring down through the tinted glass window at the absolute devastation unfolding directly below me. The elegant crowd immediately recoiled from the stage, backing away from Valerie as if she were carrying an infectious disease. Whispers of horror and disgust erupted across the room. Valerie stood frozen behind the dead microphone, her mouth open in a silent scream, her hair trembling as she stared up at the massive screens playing her own monstrous confession. Her brilliant emerald gown suddenly looked like a cheap, pathetic costume. She spun around wildly, her panicked eyes searching the crowd for an escape. Down on the floor, Preston slowly stood up from his isolated table. The glass of dark amber liquor slipped from his trembling hand, shattering violently against the polished marble floor. He stared at the giant projection of his wife, kissing the man who had threatened to murder his family. The undeniable reality of his profound betrayal finally crushed the remaining breath from his weak lungs. I shifted my gaze toward the primary emergency exit. Damon was no longer standing in the shadows. The second his face appeared on the screens, the seasoned criminal recognized the trap. He had already slipped through the brass doors, abandoning Valerie entirely, to face the cataclysmic fallout alone. The federal agents were waiting for him in the dark alleyway. The magnificent illusion was completely shattered, and the brutal, undeniable truth had finally taken the stage. The grand ballroom erupted into absolute chaos. The elegant veneer of high society dissolved instantly into a frantic cacophony of shrieks and panicked shouts. The wealthy guests scrambled blindly toward the main exits, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive scandal unfolding on the stage. I remained completely still in the quiet isolation of the control booth, watching the final act of this tragedy play out with absolute clarity. Down on the polished dance floor, Preston finally collapsed. He fell heavily to his knees, his hands clutching his head as the crushing weight of reality fractured his mind. The terrifying realization that his beautiful wife had systematically used him, manipulated his fears, and orchestrated his total destruction finally broke him. He wept not just for his lost freedom, but for the agonizing truth that his entire marriage was a calculated financial transaction. He was a pathetic, shattered shell of a man, weeping uncontrollably amidst the shattered glass of his dropped drink. Meanwhile, Damon realized the alleyway was compromised and violently pivoted back into the building. He sprinted frantically toward the discreet service elevator located near the catering kitchen, his black suit a blur of desperate motion. He threw his shoulder against the heavy swinging doors, but he never made it to the service corridor. 6 undercover federal agents, previously disguised as banquet waiters and security staff, swarmed him from every direction. They tackled the notorious syndicate lender to the marble floor with brutal efficiency. Damon fought viciously, twisting and cursing, but the agents quickly subdued him, binding his wrists with heavy steel cuffs. The loan shark who had terrorized my family was finally neutralized, stripped of his arrogant power. On the illuminated stage, Valerie was no longer the poised, untouchable socialite. 2 federal agents marched purposefully up the short staircase, their badges glinting under the crystal chandeliers. Valerie shrieked, backing away until she hit the edge of the large projection screen. Her emerald gown tore against a chair as she thrashed, screaming that it was all a terrible misunderstanding. She desperately tried to bargain, her voice a hysterical, high-pitched whine, but the agents were unmoved. They grabbed her arms forcefully, twisting them behind her back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs echoed through the remaining silence of the room. As the agents dragged her down the stairs, she screamed wildly, citing conspiracy and wire fraud charges, finally understanding that her perfect getaway to Geneva had been replaced by a concrete federal cell. I stepped out of the audiovisual booth and descended the carpeted staircase to the main floor. The federal task force had secured the perimeter, illuminating the grand lobby with the flashing red and blue lights of dozens of squad cars. I walked slowly across the deserted dance floor, the soles of my heavy boots crunching against the broken glass. I approached my son. Preston looked up at me from his knees, his face soaked in tears. his eyes silently pleading for a salvation I would never offer. My expression remained entirely unreadable. I did not speak a single word of comfort, nor did I offer a hand to pull him up. I walked past my sobbing son, leaving him to face the devastating consequences of his own profound weakness. I pushed open the heavy front doors and stepped out into the crisp, cool night air. The city felt incredibly peaceful, completely cleansed of the treacherous rot that had infected my bloodline. I walked down the street to where I had parked my truck. Martha was waiting quietly in the passenger seat, having returned safely from Wisconsin. I opened the door, climbed inside, and took her hand. She looked at me with deep understanding, asking no questions about the sirens wailing in the distance. I had secured my commercial empire, protected my beloved wife, and permanently excised the poison from our lives. The trap had closed perfectly. To every single parent watching this story today, never confuse love with blind trust. We spend decades breaking our backs to build a safety net for our children, hoping they will honor our sacrifices. But when respect is replaced by pure entitlement, you must have the courage to pull that net away. True strength isn't just in what you build. It is in having the conviction to tear it down when the people you love try to use your empire as a weapon against you. Protect your peace, protect your legacy, and never let anyone mistake your silence for weakness. Have you ever caught a loved one in a web of lies? How did you confront them? Tell me your story in the comments below. Please do not forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell for more stories about surviving life's toughest betrayals.
I used to ride upon your shoulders, thinking you could touch the sky. Every road felt less uncertain when I saw the world through your eyes. You were stronger than the mountains, taller than the northern pines. And when the winter winds were coming, you would stand between them and I. Time kept moving like the river, years slipped slowly out to sea. But no matter where life took me, you were always part of me. I am my father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. You taught me strength is not in power, but in kindness when it's hard. You taught me how to keep on going when the road grows cold and dark. Every lesson, every story, every laugh around the flame lies within me like an echo, calling softly through my name. And when I face my greatest battles, when I feel I can't go on, I can hear your voice beside me saying, child, you're stronger than you know. I am my father's daughter, in every step I things that never go. Not the gold or not the stories, not the battles that he won, but the quiet way he loved her and the woman she becomes. I am my father's daughter, and I always will remain. Through every triumph, every loss, through every joy and every pain, the world may change around me, the stars may fade above, but I will always carry with me my Father's endless love. And when they ask me who I am, I'll smile and answer softly.